The headline reached Lena Mercer before the pain medication wore off. She was lying half upright in a private recovery room on the 12th floor of St. Catherine's, one hand pressed against the fresh incision beneath her ribs, when her college friend and general counsel, Nora Feld, stepped inside carrying coffee she had forgotten to drink and a face too carefully arranged to be harmless. Lena knew that expression. It belonged to people about to tell families that something had gone wrong in surgery, or investors that a company was stable while it quietly bled. Nora shut the door, locked it, and held out her phone without a word. On the screen was a photo of Lena's husband, Adrian Vale, smiling under white roses in the marble atrium of the city clerk's office. Beside him stood his executive assistant, Camille Dorsey, in a silk suit the color of winter champagne. Her hand was looped through Adrian's arm. The caption underneath was cheerful, obscene, and public. Tech CEO Adrian Vale marries longtime colleague in intimate ceremony while wife recovers from medical crisis. For one suspended second, Lena thought the morphine had turned cruel. Then she saw details only reality could invent. Camille was wearing the diamond bracelet Lena's mother had left her. Adrian's tie was the navy one Lena had bought in Florence during the one anniversary trip he had managed not to cut short for a board call. Behind them, blurred but visible, was the registrar Lena and Adrian had used 8 years earlier when they had eloped between investor meetings and promised each other they would hold a proper celebration later. Later had apparently arrived without her. Lena lowered the phone slowly. The monitors near her bed kept reporting her pulse in steady mechanical tones, but a different machine had started inside her chest, something cold and exact. "How?" she asked. Her voice sounded almost calm. Nora put the coffee on the windowsill. "The filing packet included a divorce order with your electronic signature. It was pushed through in Nevada 3 weeks ago. The court record says you consented to remote proceedings because of your hospitalization." Lena stared at her. 3 weeks ago she had been unconscious after emergency surgery for a ruptured appendix that had turned septic because she had ignored pain for 2 days to finish a licensing negotiation. She remembered the ambulance, the blinding hallway lights, Adrian squeezing her hand once and saying, "Just rest, I'll manage everything." She had believed him because she had still been naive enough to separate marriage from governance. She had built Meridian Neural with him from a rented warehouse, but the algorithms that made its recovery monitoring devices valuable had been hers long before Adrian learned how to pronounce their technical names in investor meetings. She had written them during her fellowship, refined them after her brother's spinal injury, and protected them inside a licensing framework so complicated Adrian used to joke that it required a priest, a litigator, and an astrophysicist to decode. "He used my signature?" she asked. "And married his secretary while I was in a hospital bed?" Nora's mouth tightened. "He used more than your signature. He used your temporary incapacity to call an emergency board vote, installed himself as sole operating authority, and issued a press statement implying you're stepping away for health reasons." Lena turned her head toward the rain-laced window. Manhattan looked blurred and hard-edged at once, the way it always did after bad news. She thought of Adrian standing at the foot of her hospital bed 2 nights earlier, kissing her forehead, asking whether she remembered authorizing the transfer of voting rights to streamline recovery operations. She had been feverish. She had told him to leave the paperwork for Nora. He had smiled too quickly and changed the subject. "Did the board know?" she asked. 2 members voted against him. 1 abstained. The others relied on documents he presented. Nora sat beside the bed and lowered her voice. "Lena, there's more. He's moved Camille into the penthouse. Your staff says she's already introducing herself as Mrs. Vale in the executive suite. That should have hurt most, perhaps. Another woman in Lena's home, in her elevator, in the kitchen she had renovated around sunlight and quiet. Instead what Lena felt was insult refined into clarity. Adrian had not merely betrayed her. He had timed it for maximum convenience, assuming surgery, fatigue, and public sympathy would keep her soft while he rewrote ownership. He had mistaken her absence for surrender. She asked for her tablet. Nora hesitated only long enough to appreciate the tone. 10 minutes later Lena was reading filings through a haze of antibiotics and fury. Adrian had been ambitious enough to be dangerous and lazy enough to think theft became strategy when done through legal stationery. The divorce petition used a copied signature from an old financing package. The power authorization cited a codicil that no longer existed. The board resolution referred to company-owned foundational patents, though every foundational patent had been licensed to Meridian from Mercer Restoration Trust, an entity Adrian had always called Lena's paranoid side pocket. He had laughed at the structure so often that she had nearly explained it to him out of wounded pride. Thank God she never had. Deep in the trust instrument was a triggered reversion clause. If any licensee attempted to transfer, encumber, or represent ownership of the underlying intellectual property without the inventor's explicit wet signature and independent counsel certification, all operating rights reverted automatically at the next business day, along with immediate injunction rights and liquidated damages. Lena had created it after watching a senior surgeon lose a decade of work to a husband who thought joint tax returns meant joint authorship. By evening Adrian arrived carrying Lily's concern, and the confidence of a man who had not yet been told the floor beneath him had cracks. Camille was with him. She wore cream wool, Lena's gold hoops, and a soft expression so studied it almost deserved applause. You shouldn't be upset by online gossip, Adrian said after kissing Lena's temple as if etiquette could erase felony. The legal situation is temporary. Camille and I made a public decision to stabilize the company. Investors needed a confidence signal. Camille stepped forward. We never wanted you to find out from the press, Lena. Adrian was trying to protect your recovery. Lena looked from the earrings to the woman wearing them. By marrying my assistant while I was hospitalized? Camille had the grace to blink. Adrian exhaled as if she were making administration difficult. Don't be theatrical. Our marriage was over long before your surgery. You know that. No, Lena said. I know you became bolder after anesthesia. He set the lilies down. This can still be civilized. You'll keep the penthouse until the quarter ends, and I'll arrange a generous settlement if you avoid turning this into spectacle. Lena almost admired the audacity. She had stitched half the science inside Meridian with her own hands, mortgaged inherited property when Adrian's first round collapsed, and sat through 12-hour FDA review calls while he practiced founder mythology in front of magazines. Now he offered her back her own life in installments. Generous, she repeated. What does that buy me? Silence? Amnesia? Adrian's jaw tightened. It buys you rest. You're not well enough for a fight. That was the moment she knew he had not understood her for a single year of their marriage. Illness frightened him because it interrupted his use of people, but pain had always sharpened Lena. She held out her hand to Nora, who passed her phone across the bed. Lena dialed from memory. Judge Halpern, she said when the line connected, I'm invoking emergency inventor protection under Mercer Restoration Trust. Please notify clerk's chambers that all Meridian licenses are in presumptive breach as of 9 a.m. Tomorrow. Yes, file the authenticated packet tonight. Adrian's color changed first in his throat, then in his face. What are you doing? Lena ended the call. Recovering, she said. You should try it. I hear shock can be educational. He moved toward the bed. Nora stood. Camille took one involuntary step back. Adrian's anger had always arrived dressed as reason, but now it dropped the costume. Lena, don't be stupid. The company can't operate if you trigger review. Then perhaps you shouldn't have committed fraud during my post-op sedation. You can't prove fraud. Nora slid a folder from her case and placed it in his hand. Actually, we can prove the electronic source, the hospital timestamps, the forged witness attestation, and the unauthorized board materials. We can also prove Mrs. Mercer was under restricted medical capacity when your office transmitted her alleged consent. Camille spoke too fast. Adrian, you said legal cleared, be quiet, he snapped, and the room went still. Lena watched Camille absorb the first splash of the future she had married for. Not romance. not status. A front row seat to a man discarding whoever became inconvenient. Lena leaned back against her pillows and smiled without warmth. "Take the flowers," she said. "The scent makes me nauseous." By 9 the next morning, Meridian's internal server began pushing polite disasters to every senior inbox. Manufacturing access suspended pending license verification. Clinical deployment paused. Sales forecasts withdrawn. Escrow instructions activated. The market did not care that Adrian had smiled under roses the day before. It cared that the software core inside Meridian's flagship recovery bands no longer had legal clearance to run. By 11 the company's stock had fallen 17%. By noon 3 hospital networks had requested immediate compliance calls. By 1 Adrian was outside Lena's room again, no flowers this time, only fury cut into expensive tailoring. The hospital had moved her from critical care to a private rehabilitation suite, and security at Nora's instruction now checked everyone's credentials twice. Adrian still made it inside because marriage, however fraudulent in spirit and contested on paper, conferred enough recognition to slip past rules slower than money. He shut the door behind him and skipped concern entirely. "Reverse it," he said. "You're destroying shareholder value." Lena looked up from the rehabilitation schedule a physical therapist had just left on her tray. "I thought I was too unwell for a fight." He came closer, voice dropping to that low persuasive register investors mistook for leadership. "This ends badly for you too. The press will paint you as unstable and vindictive. You know how these stories work. Then you should have married someone with a weaker memory." Adrian planted both hands on the bed rail. "Camille is my wife." A statement impressive only if the preceding divorce was genuine. "You were checked out for months before surgery." "Checked out," Lena repeated. "I wrote the implant adaptation update from a hospital corridor 3 hours before they admitted me." He flinched because facts bored him until they wounded him. "You hid behind work," he said. "You treated me like an accessory to your brilliance." Lena considered that. It was almost truth in reverse. She had treated him like a partner far longer than evidence supported. "No," she said softly. "I treated you like a man capable of standing beside me without trying to own what I built." Adrian opened his mouth again, but his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, swore, and answered. Lena listened as panic from the other end reshaped his posture. A lender wanted immediate collateral clarification. A distributor had frozen a rollout. Someone from legal was asking whether the trust challenge was real. "Tell them nothing," Adrian snapped. "I'm handling it." When he hung up, Lena said, "You are, poorly." After he left, Nora brought news and paperwork in equal measure. The emergency filing had landed cleanly in federal court. Hospital IT had preserved device logs showing Lena's sedation windows. The Nevada clerk had flagged the divorce order for review after comparing her alleged remote testimony against inpatient records proving she had been intubated during part of the proceeding. "There's one complication," Nora said, sliding into the chair near the window. "Adrian's trying to recast this as a mental capacity dispute. He's implying post-sepsis confusion." Lena let out one sharp laugh. "Classic. If a woman remembers too much, call her emotional. If she catches fraud, call her impaired." Nora nodded. "He's also scheduled a press appearance with Camille this afternoon." Lena looked at the skyline, then back at the stack of filings. "Good. Let him perform before the trap is visible." Nora studied her. "You already have another trap?" "Several," Lena said. "Adrian has spent 8 years ignoring the only subject that mattered. He still thinks the trust is just a vault. It isn't." She reached for a yellow legal pad and began writing names. By evening those names had started answering. A systems architect who had once left Meridian after Adrian publicly took credit for her audit findings. A clinical liaison who remembered Lena sleeping on office sofas during pilot trials while Adrian flirted with journalists in the lobby. A lab manager who still had archived notebooks proving which models predated the company's incorporation. Loyalty had never adored Adrian, it had simply feared invoices and titles. Once Lena's challenge made survival possible, silence began to loosen. The most surprising message came through Nora's assistant just before sunset. Gabriel Thorne requests 10 minutes whenever Dr. Mercer is ready. Lena looked twice before responding. Gabriel Thorne was the founder of Northreach Medical, Meridian's fiercest competitor and the only man Adrian hated more than regulators. He was older by 6 years, precise to the point of legend, and known for building companies the way military engineers built bridges, as if collapse were an insult to mathematics. Lena had met him only 3 times at conferences. Each time he had listened when she spoke and corrected people who credited Adrian for her work without performing the correction loudly enough to embarrass her. "Why does Gabriel Thorne want to talk to me?" Nora asked. Lena already suspected. Northreach had tried to license her adaptation engine twice. Adrian had killed the conversations both times, saying he would rather bury the code than let a rival know how dependent Meridian was on her. "Because the market just learned what he probably guessed years ago," Lena said. She accepted the call. Gabriel appeared on screen from what looked like a glass-walled office lit by rain. He did not waste her energy with sympathy performed for advantage. "Dr. Mercer," he said, "I'm sorry for the circumstances. I'll be direct. Adrian will spend the next week trying to outshout the documents. You need stable ground before the noise peaks." Lena said nothing. Gabriel continued. "Northreach owns an unoccupied research floor in Soho. Secure servers, wet lab capacity, independent compliance channels. Use it. Free. No equity claim, no publicity conditions, no employment tie. Your people can work there while litigation runs." Nora's brows rose almost to her hairline. Lena asked the necessary question. "Why?" Gabriel's expression did not change. "Because I have spent 7 years watching lesser men monetize your mind. Because he will try to isolate you. And because I prefer winning against people who are honest about whose work they're bringing to the field." The offer should have felt opportunistic. Instead it felt clean. "Occupancy agreement?" Lena asked. "Already drafted," Gabriel said. "Short-term, revocable by you, no option clauses, no IP language beyond confidentiality." He knew exactly what reassurance mattered. Lena exhaled slowly. "Send it to Nora." Gabriel inclined his head. "One more thing. Adrian announced a founder summit for Friday. He and your secretary bride plan to unveil Meridian's new vision of care. If they demonstrate anything using your unauthorized core, your damages multiply." Lena pictured Adrian on stage in dark blue, Camille smiling beside him, both mistaking cosmetics for architecture. "Then I hope the cameras are working," she said. When the call ended, Nora leaned back and gave Lena a long look. "He's either very dangerous or very decent." "Possibly both," Lena said. Then she picked up her pen again and began outlining the first public dismantling of her husband's new marriage. Friday afternoon arrived bright and merciless, the kind of September day that made glass towers look like promises no one had earned. Lena was still technically recovering, still moving carefully, still under strict instructions not to overextend. She ignored the phrase because people always used it to mean remain small enough for other people's comfort. Nora had arranged a wheelchair for the short distance from the car to the back entrance of the Midtown Conference Center, and Lena accepted it only because exhaustion was a physiological fact, not a moral failing. She wore charcoal silk, flat black shoes, and the simple silver ring her brother had given her after his first successful rehabilitation walk. No diamonds. No public armor except competence. Gabriel met them at the service corridor with 2 compliance attorneys and a badge clipped to his jacket. "You look steadier than the headlines deserve," he said. It was not flirtation. It was observation. Lena appreciated the difference. "And you look like a man who enjoys boardroom funerals," she replied. The corner of his mouth moved almost into a smile. "Only when the deceased forged signatures." Inside the ballroom, Adrian was already speaking from the stage beneath a giant screen that read Meridian Reimagined. Camille stood near him in white, every angle polished, the very image of curated transition. The audience was a profitable mix of analysts, healthcare administrators, journalists, and people who liked being seen near expensive innovation. Adrian had always understood how to rent legitimacy by the hour. He was telling the room that Meridian's future rested on streamlined leadership and renewed emotional intelligence, phrases vague enough to suggest growth without requiring substance. Then he introduced Camille as the operational heart of our next chapter, and applause rose from tables where no one yet knew the check would bounce. Lena waited until he began the live demonstration. On the screen appeared a diagnostic dashboard powered by the adaptation engine she had written in Fellowship. Its predictive recovery model was unmistakable. So was the proprietary interface architecture registered to her trust. Gabriel nodded once to the compliance team. One attorney stepped toward the AV booth. Another moved to the side aisle where two federal marshals, already briefed, were waiting for the signal. Adrian clicked through projected outcomes with the confidence of a man who believed presentation had already become truth. Camille took the microphone to add a line about human-centered continuity, then ad-libbed beyond her comprehension. Our new platform can even infer neuropathic pathways without individualized calibration, she said brightly. Around the room, 3 neurologists stopped chewing. Lena almost felt sorry for her. Technical ignorance in private could be survivable. Technical ignorance amplified under litigation was a confession with better lighting. Nora rose from the rear row first. That statement is false, she said, not loudly, but through a room with the acoustics of money. The sentence traveled like a blade. Heads turned. Adrian saw Lena a heartbeat later. The color left his face so quickly it was nearly elegant. Lena, he said into the microphone, trying for astonishment instead of terror, you shouldn't be here. She stood from the wheelchair, steadied herself, and answered without raising her voice. And yet my work is. Silence spread. Cameras reoriented with insect speed. Gabriel's attorney handed a packet to the moderator, to the lead investor at table 3, and to the conference organizer who had not expected civil war with dessert. Nora walked down the center aisle like a woman delivering final grades. Meridian Neural is presently under federal challenge for unauthorized use of inventor-licensed code, forged transfer documents, and material misrepresentation to investors and care partners, she said. We are serving notice that any demonstration today involving the Mercer adaptation engine constitutes ongoing infringement. Adrian recovered enough to smile at the crowd, but the smile had gone thin and brittle. This is a private marital dispute being dramatized for leverage. Lena kept her eyes on him. Then explain why my alleged consent was filed while I was under surgical restriction. Explain why the model on your screen contains calibration layers written 4 years before your company incorporated. Explain why your wife just promised a feature the system cannot perform without violating patient safety thresholds. Camille turned toward Adrian, horror replacing polish by degrees. You told me legal cleared the platform, she whispered, and the microphone caught enough of it to become evidence. The next 10 minutes were not dramatic in the cinematic sense. No one shouted. No glasses broke. Real destruction at that level usually arrived through documents and pauses. The conference organizer suspended the session. The marshals approached the stage to preserve demonstration hardware pursuant to temporary order. Investors began checking phones, then leaving tables in pairs, speaking too softly. A journalist from Health Ledger asked whether Meridian had disclosed the licensing challenge before promoting a rollout. Adrian answered with a paragraph that contained no verbs of ownership. Another reporter asked Camille whether she had operational certification in clinical systems. Camille froze, then said she had worked closely with leadership. The phrase landed like a resume collapsing in public. Lena watched the room understand them in layers, not visionaries, not a controversial love story, but amateurs wearing a machine they had not built. It did not feel like revenge yet. It felt like correction, and correction had its own clean pleasure. Afterward, in a private room loaned by the conference center to avoid a lobby riot, Lena sat on the edge of a leather chair while adrenaline gave way to the body's arithmetic. Gabriel poured water and handed it to her without asking whether she preferred sparkling. "You were right about the cameras," he said. Nora was already fielding calls from hospital networks that wanted new licensing channels as soon as possible. "Camille's statement about neuropathic inference may have saved us a week of discovery," she added. Lena sipped water and let herself breathe. "He always recruited mirrors," she said. "People who could reflect confidence without testing the depth beneath it." Gabriel leaned against the console table, arms folded. "That works until the room contains someone who knows the load-bearing walls." She looked up at him, really looked this time. There was sympathy there, but it was disciplined, not hungry. He was careful with his attention, as if aware attention itself could become a form of pressure. It made her more aware of him, not less. The smear campaign started before dusk. Adrian's spokesperson circulated a statement calling Lena's appearance an unfortunate symptom of post-operative emotional strain. Anonymous accounts online claimed she had always been difficult, brilliant but unstable, a scientist unable to accept the human side of leadership. One entertainment blog published side-by-side photos of Lena leaving rehabilitation and Camille at the wedding, inviting readers to decide who looked more like the future of Meridian. Nora fumed. Gabriel's crisis team offered to bury 3 of the nastier stories with counter-briefings. Lena refused both extremes. "No mud," she said. "No wounded wife narrative. They want me sentimental or hysterical because those are easier to brand." She turned to the whiteboard in the borrowed office where Meridian's former systems architect had begun mapping evidence chains. "We answer with authorship, timelines, and competence." The room nodded because most of the people in it had been waiting years for someone to choose fact over theater with enough authority to make it stick. By midnight the temporary Northreach lab was full of boxes, archived notebooks, and exhausted loyalists discovering what relief felt like when mixed with fury. Lena walked the floor slowly, touching benches, cables, and sealed storage bins as if greeting a new country. Gabriel had given them an entire wing and then vanished to another level so the space would feel truly hers. Near 1 a.m. he returned carrying takeout containers and a first aid kit because one of the coders had sliced her palm opening hardware crates. No announcement. No performance. He just set the food down, patched the cut, and asked Lena whether the server partitioning met her confidentiality requirements. The ordinariness of the moment hit her harder than the summit had. Adrian had always loved the visible victory, the stage, the camera, the dramatic bouquet. Gabriel seemed to understand that real rescue often looked like encryption settings and soup at 1 a.m. Lena opened one of the containers, smelled ginger and broth, and realized for the first time since surgery that she was hungry. The first week in the temporary lab reorganized the world more efficiently than grief ever could. Lena's recovery advanced in measured increments. Fewer pain spikes, longer stretches upright, the return of appetite, the ability to climb stairs without bargaining with every muscle. At the same time, the legal fight sharpened from outrage into architecture. Every day began with medical clearance, then document review, then technical rebuilding. Nora ran litigation from a glass conference room lined with sealed banker boxes. Former Meridian engineers reconstructed authorship trails from notebook scans and backup logs. Compliance specialists drafted letters to hospital systems explaining that continuity of care would be preserved through emergency licensing under Mercer restoration. Adrian, meanwhile, spent his days talking to cameras and pretending market collapse was a weather event. He posted a photo with Camille on the penthouse terrace captioned "Stability requires courage." 2 hours later, a second distributor suspended orders pending fraud review. The comments under his post were less admiring than he hoped. Camille proved less graceful under pressure than under ring lights. She began releasing short videos from the executive suite, soft-lit monologues about resilience, partnership, and women supporting women in leadership transitions. The last phrase offended Lena more than the wedding. In one clip, Camille stood beside the sculptural oak credenza Lena had chosen for patent signing ceremonies and called Meridian the company Adrian built from a sketchbook and a dream. The internet loved the dress and doubted the history. Northreach's research interns, who had grown up reading actual trade coverage, immediately began stitching public timelines that showed Lena presenting core recovery models at conferences years before Meridian existed. A spine surgeon in Chicago posted a photograph of an old conference program listing Lena as principal investigator and Adrian as business development attendee. Another clinician uploaded a panel clip where Adrian had introduced himself as married to the genius in the room. The internet, fickle but not wholly useless, started asking unprofitable questions. Lena still refused to go online herself. "Attention is oxygen for people like Adrian," she told Nora. "I'd rather alter the pressure in the room." So they prepared a technical briefing instead. Not a press conference. Not a betrayal interview. A clinical authorship session with timestamps, prototype lineage, and independent witnesses. Gabriel insisted on hosting it at Northreach's Education Center because the broadcast infrastructure was secure and the building's badge logs could later verify everyone present. "I assume you expect sabotage," Lena said. "I expect Adrian," Gabriel replied. He said it the way one might say rain before packing tarps. The briefing drew more interest than anyone admitted publicly. By the morning of the event, 6 healthcare systems, 3 insurers, and a federal procurement observer had requested stream access. Suddenly Adrian's romantic optics had to compete with spreadsheets, and spreadsheets were rarely kind to narcissists. Lena opened the session herself, standing this time without assistance behind a simple lectern. She wore dark green, no jewelry except her brother's ring, and the expression of a surgeon about to correct a chart. "This is not a personal statement," she began. "It is an authorship and patient safety statement." Then she walked the room through 15 years of work. Early algorithm drafts from her rehabilitation fellowship. Prototype bands tested after her brother's accident. Grant applications naming Mercer Restoration as originating entity. Emails where Adrian explicitly described himself as commercial-led while asking whether a graph was the one that makes doctors feel optimistic. The audience laughed once at that, briefly and with embarrassment. Lena did not. She moved with clean precision from authorship to licensing, from licensing to unauthorized transfer, from unauthorized transfer to the specific technical falsehoods Camille had spoken on stage. A neurologist from Boston asked whether Meridian's current demo build could safely make adaptive predictions without individualized recalibration. "No," Lena said. "Not unless physics has changed and neglected to notify me." The room respected certainty because certainty arrived carrying proof. Former Meridian employees testified by affidavit and, in 3 cases, in person. The system's architect Lena had written down in the hospital explained how Adrian had repeatedly requested simplified internal documentation so he could sound more visionary with investors. The clinical liaison described Lena sleeping in testing suites after 16-hour observation cycles while Adrian flew to a branding retreat in Carmel. Then came the detail that shifted the mood from scandal to danger. One of Meridian's rushed update branches had altered threshold warnings to make demo outcomes look faster than the patient data supported. "Was it deployed clinically?" a hospital administrator asked, suddenly pale. Lena shook her head. "Not through authorized channels. But the fact that it existed is enough for every provider here to rethink trust." When the session ended, people did not applaud. They formed lines to speak with Nora, which was better. Adrian retaliated that night with nostalgia. He requested a private meeting through 3 intermediaries, each message more sentimental than the last. He said he wanted to remember who they had been before lawyers and cameras. He said Camille was a mistake accelerated by crisis. He said he missed Lena's steadiness. That last line nearly made her answer, if only to ask whether he meant steadiness or utility. Instead she agreed to meet him in Nora's office with 2 associates present and the conversation recorded. Adrian arrived without his wedding ring. The gesture was meant to imply possibility, remorse, and intimacy. On him it looked like inventory management. "You know me better than anyone," he said after declining water. "You know I panic when things spin beyond control." Lena folded her hands. "You forged a divorce while I was under anesthesia. I thought you were leaving anyway. So you helped me?" He winced. I'm saying the marriage was dead. Marriages can die, Lena replied. What you did was rob the corpse. He tried to pivot into memory. Their warehouse years. Pizza on concrete floors. The first hospital contract. The night she cried after her brother's relapse and he held her until dawn. For one dangerous instant, Lena remembered that night too, the comfort of being witnessed when pain had no language. Then she remembered the follow-up email from Adrian to investors the next morning, using the relapse to explain why she might be emotionally difficult during negotiations. She had found it years later and buried the knowledge because ambition can make women generous toward their own diminishment. You don't miss me, she said quietly. You miss the life where I solved every structural problem before it reached you. Adrian's face hardened, then softened again because he preferred masks to skin. Camille never mattered like you mattered. She mattered enough to marry while I had surgical drains. I thought you might not come back. There it was. Not grief. Not fear for her life. A logistical assessment. Lena stood. Then let me remove all uncertainty. I'm back. 2 days later Meridian announced a human-centered reform initiative led by Camille, who now called herself a leadership consultant despite no evident qualifications beyond adjacency. The initiative lasted 6 hours before a reporter discovered Camille's newly formed consulting company had invoiced Meridian nearly $900,000 over the previous year for strategic cultural optimization. The address on the invoices belonged to a mailbox store in Tribeca. Nora nearly smiled when she read that part aloud. If they were trying to appear innocent, she said, they should have billed less and spelled culture correctly. The forensic accountants she had retained began tracing related party payments and found more: jewelry charged as outreach gifts, penthouse renovations booked as client hospitality, a luxury car lease hidden under field mobility expenses. Adrian had not merely stolen Lena's work. He had used the company as if corporate funds were applause that could be spent. The mood at Northreach shifted from defensive to purposeful. Lena's team rebuilt the next-generation monitoring suite under a provisional brand, Mercer Continuum. Hospital systems that had once deferred to Adrian now requested direct meetings with her. Gabriel attended only when invited and spoke little in those meetings, yet his presence changed the room. People listened harder when a respected rival lent legitimacy without claiming ownership. One night after a 14-hour strategy session, Lena found him on the terrace outside the 7th-floor break lounge, jacket off, tie loosened, city lights reflected in the windows behind him. Why haven't you asked for anything, she said. Gabriel looked at her over the rim of a coffee cup. I did. I asked you to use a lab. No eventual merger pitch? No equity clause hidden under paragraph 14? Lena, he said, and her name and his voice sounded like respect rather than leverage, I am interested in your mind, not your exhaustion. She stood beside him in silence so long it stopped feeling like silence at all. Criminality announced itself not through drama but through columns that failed to reconcile. Nora's accountants had been reviewing Meridian's reimbursement pathways for only 48 hours when one of them requested an urgent call. Lena joined from the rehab bike, still pedaling because stopping suddenly made the incision ache. On the screen, a gray-haired forensic specialist named Marta Ivers highlighted a sequence of payments routed through shell vendors attached to post-acute care pilot programs. These were represented as patient device support contracts, Marta said. But the service logs are fabricated. No nurses, no tech visits, no field teams. The funds landed in intermediary entities, then washed out to personal accounts, luxury purchases, and Camille Dorsey Consulting. Adrian had graduated from vanity to embezzlement. Lena kept pedaling. How much? Conservatively? 4.8 million. Possibly more if the hidden leases are tied to grant money. Nora added, and if grant money is involved, federal agencies enter the chat. Lena looked at the screen until the numbers stopped resembling abstract wrongdoing and became what they were: money diverted from patients, trials, staff, and trust. Adrian had always loved the appearance of mission. Apparently he loved billing against it even more. The second discovery was crueler. A nurse supervisor from St. Catherine's called Nora directly after seeing press coverage about the forged divorce. She was nervous and kept apologizing as if truth were an intrusion. During Lena's hospitalization, someone from Adrian's office had repeatedly requested her medication chart and private capacity assessments using hospital stationery altered to look as if Lena had pre-authorized broad spousal access. One request had included a handwritten note asking whether continued sedation might reduce agitation during family legal proceedings. The nurse had refused, documented the attempt, and heard nothing more. Until now. Lena listened without blinking. When the call ended, her hands shook so violently she had to grip the rehab handlebars to hide it. Gabriel, who had stepped into the conference room halfway through, said nothing until everyone else filed out. Then he crossed to her slowly and crouched so his eyes were level with hers. "Do you need the room?" he asked, "or a witness?" It was such a precise question that it broke her. Not because she cried, she didn't. Because for the first time in weeks she felt the difference between being managed and being seen. Adrian chose that same week to sue for declaratory control of Meridian, alleging that Lena's post-crisis instability made her incapable of fulfilling fiduciary responsibilities. His lawyer submitted photographs of her in the wheelchair outside the summit as if mobility assistance were proof of professional decay. Camille provided an affidavit describing Lena as increasingly obsessive about ownership during the months before surgery. Obsessive about ownership, Nora repeated with disgust. As if the inventor wanting to keep her invention is pathology. They counterfiled with medical testimony, litigation sanctions requests, and enough authentication records to make even a sympathetic judge irritated. Still, Adrian's strategy had a logic familiar to every woman who had ever produced more than the room expected. If he could not outbuild her, he would try to medicalize her competence. Lena decided the answer was not another statement but another demonstration. She invited 2 hospital systems to trial Mercer Continuum under emergency physician oversight, with independent safety monitors and public methodology summaries. "Let outcome speak," she said. Outcome is the only language Adrian never bothered to learn. The trials began in Chicago and Philadelphia within 10 days. Lena flew to neither city because she was not fully cleared for travel, but she worked the protocols from Manhattan with a fervor that made the younger engineers half afraid of disappointing her and half willing to live on cold noodles forever if that was what the project required. Gabriel insisted she keep clinical rest intervals on the shared calendar and instructed his staff to route around them as if they were immovable board mandates. When she accused him of bullying disguised as courtesy, he answered, yes. Then he brought her revised server reports and a sandwich she actually ate. Their romance, if it could be called that yet, grew in edges rather than declarations. He remembered that she hated sparkling water. She learned that he loosened every tie by pulling once at the knot with his left hand, like a habit formed in graduate school and never unlearned. He asked about her brother without turning the question into tragedy. She asked why he never married. Timing, he said. Later, when she said nothing, he added, and standards. Camille, meanwhile, was learning that being chosen by a disloyal man was not the same thing as being protected by him. Investigators served document requests on her consulting entity. Fashion blogs that had celebrated her wedding now ran whispery items about executive overreach and invoice glamour. She began calling former Meridian employees personally, asking whether they still felt connected to the mission. One recorded the call and sent it to Nora. In the clip, Camille sounded frightened beneath the polish. Adrian says if Lena would just settle quietly, none of this needs to get ugly, she said. The employee replied, it got ugly when he married you between her antibiotics. Lena almost deleted the recording after 10 seconds, then made herself finish it. She needed to understand the fracture lines. Camille had entered the story believing she was ascending into power. Now she was realizing she had been hired as decor for a coup. Sympathy was possible in theory. In practice, the forged affidavit had used it up. Mercer Continuum's first interim outcomes outperformed Meridian's old benchmarks by 17% in adaptive rehabilitation compliance. The results were preliminary, carefully caveat, and still devastating. Hospitals did not need tabloid morality when they had numbers. Investors from Adrian's dwindling support base began contacting Nora about settlement frameworks that did not include him. One board member resigned publicly, admitting he had relied on materially incomplete representations during the emergency transfer vote. Another offered sworn testimony that Adrian had repeatedly referred to Lena's hospitalization as a narrow window to simplify governance. Those exact words, once transcribed, circulated through the legal teams like accelerant. Nora looked younger every time new evidence arrived. I became a lawyer for this exact category of idiot, she confessed one night over takeout containers and deposition charts. Lena smiled despite herself. To help women? Nora speared a dumpling. No. To punish men who confuse access with entitlement. Adrian requested one final private conversation before the injunction hearing. This time Lena refused in person and agreed only to a video call recorded by counsel. He appeared from the penthouse library wearing cashmere and exhaustion, the skyline glowing behind him in a way that would have made him look tragic to people who had not read invoices. You're enjoying this, he said without preamble. Lena looked at him on the monitor and saw a man who had always mistaken admiration for oxygen. No, she said. I'm correcting it. He laughed bitterly. You always wanted credit more than love. No. I wanted a world where love didn't require surrendering credit. I made you bigger than you ever would have been alone. She almost thanked him for saying it on a recorded line. You marketed what I built, she replied. That is not the same thing. His face twisted. Camille says you've got thorns circling. Is that your new strategy? Trade one ambitious man for another? Lena leaned toward the camera. You still don't understand the difference between partnership and acquisition. The injunction hearing filled half the courtroom with people Adrian used to call friends. By the end of the first day, several could no longer meet his eyes. The judge, an unsentimental woman with a habit of removing her glasses before delivering dangerous questions, seemed especially unimpressed by the forged divorce timeline. When Adrian's counsel tried again to insinuate medical unreliability, she interrupted to ask whether they wished to continue that argument in light of the attending physician's affidavit describing Lena as lucid during all relevant periods except the exact windows in which the disputed filings were submitted. The coincidence is breathtaking, she said dryly. Camille testified after lunch and performed composure until cross-examination reached the consulting invoices. Then the performance frayed. She admitted Adrian had told her the payments were temporary optics compensation until the company could formalize her value. She admitted he drafted most of her public statements. She admitted she never independently verified the divorce. Did you ask, Nora said gently, whether a woman on 4 antibiotics had truly consented to remote proceedings dissolving her marriage? Camille swallowed. He said it was handled. That wasn't my question. That evening, after the hearing adjourned, Lena found Gabriel in the empty Education Center auditorium where they had first held the authorship briefing. He was sitting 3 rows from the front reviewing tomorrow's witness list. She sat beside him. Neither spoke for a minute. Finally she said, I am angrier about the hospital requests than the marriage. Gabriel closed the folder. Because the marriage was vanity, he said. And the hospital was control. She turned toward him. Yes. He considered her with that maddening precision of his. Then don't minimize the first wound just because the second was worse. She let the sentence settle. So much of survival had required ranking injuries, choosing which insult was worth spending blood on. Gabriel seemed to reject the entire economy. You don't have to be efficient with your grief, he added. Lena laughed once, softly. You say romantic things like a compliance manual. It's an underserved market. She kissed him before she could overthink it, one hand against his jaw, brief and real. When she pulled back, he did not chase or claim. He only said, thank you for the warning. That restraint was more intimate than pursuit. The court granted the preliminary injunction in language so clear even business reporters stopped romanticizing the dispute. Adrian was barred from representing ownership of the core engine, barred from transferring or encumbering Meridian assets tied to disputed IP, and ordered to surrender devices, source code branches, and communication archives for forensic review. The judge also referred the forged divorce packet and hospital record requests to federal investigators. By noon, every headline had changed shape. This was no longer a glamorous founder marriage gone messy. It was a fraud story with wedding photos attached. Adrian responded the only way he knew how, by trying to accelerate reality past the point where people could verify it. He announced a desperate strategic merger discussion with a foreign distributor and scheduled a private investor dinner at the penthouse. Nora, after reading the notice, looked ready to laugh on a national security level. "He's trying to sell a burning staircase," she said. Lena studied the date. The forensic imaging team would have first-pass server results by then. "Let him host dinner," she replied. "Maybe the silverware can hear the indictment coming." The server results arrived with more brutality than elegance. Adrian had not only directed unauthorized transfers, he had used private channels to hide them from Meridian's internal legal team. Deleted messages recovered from archived devices showed him instructing an operations VP to backfill authorizations later and telling Camille, "Once the ring is public, no one will question the sequence." There were spreadsheets mapping which employees could be intimidated, which vendors would play flexible, and which of Lena's archived research materials could be copied without triggering the trust nonsense. He had even joked in one exchange that surgery had solved the timing problem. Nora went white reading that line aloud. Gabriel went still in the way dangerous men do when anger passes beyond visible gesture. Lena did neither. She sat at the conference table, hands flat, and read every message to the end. Rage, she had learned, was most useful when it stayed oxygen-rich and mathematically cold. "Package it for investigators," she said. "And for the board." "All of it." Camille broke first. She arrived unannounced at the Northreach building just after 7 in the evening, wearing oversized sunglasses despite the underground parking entrance and holding herself as if cameras might still appear to rescue her. Security called Nora, who called Lena, who after a brief discussion agreed to see her in a witness room with 2 attorneys present. Camille removed the glasses and revealed eyes red from crying or strategy. With her, the distinction could never be taken for granted. "Adrian is moving money," she said immediately. "He thinks if he can close a side agreement before the criminal review advances, he can keep control of something." Nora folded her arms. "You participated in the scheme." Camille nodded too quickly. "I know how it looks." Lena's voice was calm. "It looks like you married a man during my hospitalization and signed an affidavit calling me unstable." Camille flinched. "He told me you were done with him. He said the marriage had been dead for years and that you wanted out but cared too much about image to say it first." "And that persuaded you to wear my bracelet to City Hall?" Camille's lips parted, then closed. What followed was not absolution but inventory. Camille described Adrian's panic after the injunction. The offshore calls. The plan to blame her for the consulting invoices. The hidden storage locker where he had moved prototype units and backup drives. The unsent draft statement accusing Lena of cognitive impairment tied to ongoing post-septic decline. Nora took notes with a fury so needed deserved a museum. "Why tell us now?" she asked. Camille looked at Lena rather than answering the lawyer. "Because I finally understood that he didn't choose me. He chose whoever made him feel admired in the moment. When admiration got expensive, he started looking for exits." Lena had known that since the hospital room. Hearing it from Camille changed nothing and still made something inside her settle. Not triumph. Confirmation. "If you cooperate fully," Nora said, "that will matter to prosecutors. It will not erase your part." Camille nodded. "I know." Lena rose, a little slower than healthy women rise, but with more force than most. "Then start earning the first honest sentence you've said in months." The storage locker yielded enough evidence to turn civil disaster into criminal architecture. There were prototype casings tagged with altered serial numbers, and signed stock certificates prepared for private transfer, gift receipts charged to grant accounts, and 3 backup drives containing copied research notebooks Adrian had planned to present as joint developmental materials. He had underestimated one constant in Lena's life: she labeled everything. Every draft, every protocol variant, every calibration assumption carried time-locked metadata and handwritten cross-references dating back to fellowship years. The copied materials did not blur authorship, they intensified it. Investigators from the U.S. Attorney's Office took possession before dawn. By morning, the foreign distributor had withdrawn from the secret merger dinner after receiving a discreet packet from Nora's firm describing pending exposure. Adrian reportedly smashed 2 wine glasses against the penthouse kitchen counter when the cancellation email arrived. The housekeeper told security. Security told the building manager. The building manager, wisely, told no reporters but saved the incident log. Mercer Continuum, meanwhile, moved from emergency trial to formal launch planning. Lena insisted the first public announcement focus on clinical partnerships and staff retention rather than personal narrative. "I'm not a Phoenix brand," she told the communications team. "I'm a physician-scientist who got tired of thieves." Still, the world loved Story, and Story clung to her whether she invited it or not. Profiles began appearing that called her brilliant, formidable, ruthless, long underestimated. The adjectives would have annoyed her if they had not also been useful. She negotiated new contracts under her own name, rebuilt the board structure so no spouse or partner could ever again exploit medical incapacity, and offered positions to every Meridian employee willing to come clean and choose competence over theater. Many accepted. Some didn't. She lost no sleep over those. Loyalty purchased with titles had never interested her. Loyalty earned by truth mattered more now than adoration ever had. Her relationship with Gabriel unfolded in the spaces not designed for spectacle. He walked beside her during late evening laps through the lab when incision stiffness made her restless. He learned the rhythm of her silence and did not rush to fill it. She learned that he kept a battered fountain pen from his mother in the inside pocket of every jacket because success, in his words, should never make a person forget their first witness. When he finally asked her to dinner outside work, it was after a 10-hour regulatory review and phrased like a contract provision with emotional upside. "There's a restaurant on 22nd that serves actual food after 9, he said. "If you're hungry and not too tired, I'd like to sit across from you in a context that has nothing to do with depositions." Lena considered the invitation with more caution than excitement, which was exactly why she trusted it. "I am hungry," she said. "And I reserve the right to discuss depositions anyway." Gabriel held the elevator for her. "I expect nothing less." Adrian's investor dinner never happened, but his collapse did. Federal agents arrived at Meridian's headquarters on a gray Tuesday morning with sealed warrants for records tied to wire fraud, grant misappropriation, securities misrepresentation, and document forgery. By lunchtime, every business channel in the city was running footage of investigators carrying labeled evidence boxes through the lobby where Adrian used to pose for magazine shoots. Camille, on advice of counsel and newly motivated honesty, surrendered her passport and entered formal cooperation negotiations. The board suspended Adrian immediately. 2 directors who had once toasted him at retreats now released statements praising institutional accountability and the courageous corrective work of Dr. Lena Mercer. Nora nearly choked reading that phrase aloud. "Courageous corrective work," she repeated. "That's rich from people who watched him staple himself to your reputation for years." Lena signed the transition papers anyway. Institutions rarely apologized well. What mattered was that they eventually yielded. Adrian called from a blocked number that night. Lena almost declined, then answered out of a curiosity so cold it felt clinical. He did not start with anger this time. He started with despair. "They came into my office like I was a criminal," he said. She sat at her kitchen island in the apartment Nora had insisted she use until the penthouse dispute settled. Were they mistaken? Silence. Then, Camille talked. "Yes. You set that up." Lena looked at the city beyond the glass. "No, Adrian. You set it up when you chose a woman for vanity and assumed panic would keep her loyal. He laughed once, broken and mean. You always wanted the last word. No, Lena said. I wanted the first truth. He began to say her name, perhaps to beg, perhaps to accuse, perhaps to reach for the old dynamic where her steadiness absorbed his collapse. She ended the call before finding out. Some doors did not need slamming. They only needed refusing. The penthouse became a battlefield of inventory before it became a memory. Court officers supervised the division because Adrian had tried, absurdly, to classify half the art and nearly all the furnishings as executive image assets purchased for company hospitality. Lena walked through rooms that had once held dinner parties, investor briefings, exhausted anniversaries, and the ordinary betrayals of a marriage gone hollow long before it went public. Camille's perfume still haunted the dressing room. Adrian's whiskey glasses stood aligned in the library as if order could cleanse history. Lena took almost nothing beyond what had belonged to her family before Adrian existed in her address book, her mother's bracelet, a pair of bronze bookends from her brother, journals from fellowship, and the blue ceramic bowl she had bought after signing her first solo grant. Everything else could stay with the architecture of a life built on compromise. As she stood in the doorway of the bedroom for the last time, the housekeeper approached with a sealed envelope discovered behind a stack of monogrammed stationery. It was addressed in Adrian's handwriting and never sent. Inside was a draft speech for the investor dinner, full of lies about mutual transitions, difficult but compassionate restructuring, and Lena's wish for privacy as she steps away from public leadership. At the bottom, scribbled like a reminder to himself, were 5 words, make sadness red as dignity. That scrap of handwriting enraged her more than all the polished interviews. He had reduced grief to copy direction. Even now, the event in his mind was not betrayal but presentation. She handed the paper to Nora, who slipped it into evidence with professional satisfaction. Outside, reporters waited across the street for a glimpse of either victimhood or glamour. Lena gave them neither. She left through the service entrance carrying one overnight bag and her mother's bracelet in her coat pocket. Gabriel was leaning against a black sedan at the curb, not because she needed rescuing but because he had asked whether she wanted company for the last exit and she had said yes. He took the overnight bag without comment and opened the passenger door. Once inside, Lena rested her head back and closed her eyes. I thought I'd feel lighter, she said after a block of silence. Gabriel started the car. Maybe later, he answered. Sometimes first you just feel accurate. She looked at him and laughed softly despite the ache in her throat. That might be the most reassuringly strange thing anyone has said to me all year. Mercer Continuum's formal launch took place 6 weeks later in a converted industrial hall in Chelsea that smelled faintly of steel and new paint. Lena insisted on keeping the room unflashy, no giant founder portraits, no cinematic music swells, no stagecraft pretending medicine was a perfume line. The focus was clinicians, outcomes, and a staffing pledge that guaranteed severance protections and inventor authorship transparency across every division. She announced scholarship funding in her brother's name for rehabilitation engineers from underfunded programs. She introduced former Meridian staff not as her people but as named colleagues with actual titles. Investors attended, but they did not dominate the room. Hospital partners did. Patients did. So did regulators who had once only known her as the technical genius standing half a step behind Adrian's charisma. Now no one was in front of her unless they were meant to be. Gabriel watched from the second row, expression unreadable except to Lena, who had learned that his stillness often meant pride. When she finished speaking, the standing ovation began not from the money tables but from the clinicians. That mattered more. Adrian chose the same week to make his final mistake. Out on bail pending indictment, stripped of operational authority, and increasingly abandoned by anyone who valued solvency, he arranged for a freelancer with flexible ethics to leak edited clips suggesting Lena and Gabriel had conspired for years to sabotage Meridian and exploit her hospitalization for competitive advantage. The leak might have muddied weaker waters. Unfortunately for Adrian, he had selected clips from internal footage stored on a server already mirrored by investigators. Within hours the full recordings emerged, showing him instructing staff to box Thorne out before Mercer gets ideas and joking about using marriage as a shareholder confidence structure. Nora obtained sanctions. Prosecutors amended filings to include witness intimidation and evidence manipulation. The judge revoked several privileges attached to Adrian's release and warned his counsel that any further media tampering would provoke detention review. When the news broke, Lena was in the lab adjusting trial parameters. She read the alert, handed the phone to Nora, and returned to the monitor. "He really believes the next lie will be the one that saves him," she said. Nora nodded. "That's the tragedy of men who confuse narrative control with intelligence." Camille's formal cooperation statement became public in redacted form shortly before the grand jury schedule was announced. It was thorough, humiliating, and undeniably useful. She admitted Adrian had coached her through public statements, routed compensation through shell invoices, and encouraged her to play the role of future-facing leadership spouse to stabilize board perception while Lena was hospitalized. She also admitted to enjoying the status and not asking questions because she preferred the answers she imagined. That honesty, brutal and belated, moved Lena in ways she disliked. Not toward forgiveness. Toward understanding. Camille had not been the mastermind she styled herself as, but neither had she been an innocent girl misled by a dangerous man. She had walked willingly into theft because theft looked glamorous when draped in silk and selective storytelling. The court would sort the legal weight. Lena privately hoped the deeper punishment would be self-knowledge, though prison might help with scheduling. When a reporter later asked whether she hated Camille more than Adrian, Lena answered, "No. I reserve my strongest judgments for the person who built the machine and invited others to hide inside it." Winter arrived. Lena was cleared for full travel. She visited the Chicago trial site and watched a young patient take unassisted steps while wearing a continuum band calibrated through the adaptive engine Adrian once claimed belonged to the company. The patient's mother cried. The physical therapist grinned like a woman witnessing competent miracles. Lena stood back and let the data log itself while emotion moved through her in a quieter register than vengeance ever had. This, she thought, was the entire point. Not the headlines. Not the wedding photos or court transcripts or investor reversals. This. A technology built from love, pain, discipline, and years no one photographed, returning to the people for whom it had been made. Gabriel found her in the observation room afterward. "You're crying," he said gently. Lena touched her face, surprised to discover he was right. "How embarrassing." "Not at all." He handed her a folded handkerchief as if he had been born in a century with better manners. "I'm trying very hard not to say I told you outcome mattered." She took the handkerchief. "That sounds exactly like something you're saying." Their first real holiday together was absurdly peaceful. No investors, no surveillance teams, no emergency filings. Lena cooked because it suited her. Gabriel chopped vegetables with dangerous precision and admitted, over mulled wine and rain against the windows, that he had noticed Adrian taking credit for her work the first time he ever heard them share a stage. "You were answering a technical question from the audience," he said. He interrupted, summarized badly, and everyone still looked at him afterward. "You didn't correct him." Lena set down the spoon. "I was tired." "I know." He watched steam rise from the pot. "I spent the next 5 years wondering when you'd decide enough was enough." She looked at him across the kitchen. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because a stranger publicly informing a woman that her husband is diminishing her usually helps no one." "And because you would have defended him." She hated how accurate that was. Then she loved it, because accuracy in his mouth never felt like cruelty. Later that night, when he kissed her by the window, there was no urgency in it, only certainty and room. The indictments landed 3 days after New Year's. Adrian was charged with wire fraud, securities fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and obstruction tied to the hospital record scheme. Camille was charged more narrowly and entered a cooperation plea. The tabloids tried briefly to revive the story as a spectacular love triangle gone corporate. The attempt failed because the filings were too technical and the evidence too ugly. There is only so much romance in shell invoices and manipulated sedation requests. Adrian appeared at arraignment in a dark coat and the face of a man astonished that consequences had found his address. He looked older than his years and meaner than his photographs. Lena did not attend. She spent the morning finalizing the patient equity clause in Continuum's new licensing standard, a provision ensuring low-income rehabilitation centers could access the platform without the pricing games Adrian once called necessary optics. When reporters later asked why she had skipped the arraignment, she said, "I had work that mattered." It was the truest sentence she could have offered, and the one that irritated him most when he heard it. The trial took less time than the city expected and more precision than Adrian deserved. By then the story no longer belonged to gossip columns or brand consultants. It belonged to forensic accountants, prosecutors, metadata experts, hospital administrators, and the ordinary men and women who had watched Lena work while Adrian narrated. Nora ran witness preparation like a general with a private grudge against vagueness. Gabriel sat in on exactly one session at Lena's request, then left before anyone could mistake support for influence. Camille testified on the third day in a dark suit stripped of all bridal softness. She answered carefully, admitted greed, admitted cowardice, admitted that Adrian had instructed her to act as if the marriage were the inevitable culmination of a love story rather than a tactic engineered around Lena's incapacity. "Did you love him?" the prosecutor asked. Camille looked toward the jury and said, after a long pause, "I loved being chosen." I mistook that for the same thing. It was perhaps the first sentence in her adult life that sounded fully true. Adrian chose to testify despite every warning. Narcissism has a way of translating legal risk into personal exception. He entered the witness box carrying the old confidence like a garment altered too many times. At first he performed well enough, speaking about entrepreneurship, stress, difficult marriages, and the burden of leadership in fast-growth healthcare. But fraud is hard to romanticize under cross-examination when the opposing attorney has your private jokes printed at 24-point font. Nora dismantled him by inches. She walked him through the forged divorce timeline, the investor messages, the shell invoices, the sentence about surgery solving the timing problem. Each time he tried to turn explanation into performance, she cut back to records. "Did you authorize this payment? Did you write this phrase? Were you aware Dr. Mercer was intubated when this document claims she appeared by video?" By the time she displayed the handwritten note about making sadness read as dignity, even Adrian seemed to understand the room had stopped believing in his central myth, that charm could substitute for structure. The jury looked at him the way seasoned nurses look at men who finally realize the medication isn't coming. Lena testified only once and for less than 2 hours. She kept her answers tight, factual, and free of ornament. She explained the architecture of Mercer Restoration, the logic of the reversion clauses, the authorship chain behind the adaptation engine, and the medical significance of the software Adrian had tried to parade as his own. When asked how she discovered the marriage, she did not dramatize. "My attorney showed me a published photo while I was recovering from surgery," she said. The rest became a matter of records. The prosecutor asked whether she sought revenge. Adrian's counsel objected, then withdrew the objection when the judge raised an eyebrow. Lena answered anyway. "No. I sought correction, safety, and legal accountability. Revenge is emotional theater. This was infrastructure." Several jurors wrote that down. Nora later admitted it was her favorite line of the month. Lena disliked sounding quotable in court, but if a sentence could hold truth and utility at once, there was no reason to waste it. The verdict returned after 7 hours. Guilty on the major fraud counts. Guilty on forgery. Guilty on embezzlement. Guilty on obstruction. The courtroom air changed not dramatically but conclusively, like a lock sliding into place. Adrian closed his eyes for 1 second too long. Camille, whose plea had already reshaped her exposure, cried without sound. Lena sat between Nora and her brother Daniel, who had flown in from Seattle and kept one broad, steady hand over hers until the clerk finished reading. She did not feel joy exactly. Joy was too bright and simple for what followed the formal naming of harm. She felt something denser and more durable, release without collapse, vindication without spectacle, the strange peace that comes when reality finally outruns manipulation. Outside the courthouse cameras waited, but Lena did not give them a triumphant speech. She said only, "The work was always bigger than the theft," and stepped into the car. Gabriel, waiting inside because he knew crowds after verdicts were a vulgar kind of hunger, handed her a thermos of coffee and touched her wrist once. That one touch said enough. Sentencing came later, as such things do, after impact statements and legal choreography. Adrian received 11 years. Camille received 4, reduced for cooperation and restitution terms that would take her the better part of a lifetime to satisfy. Commentators argued online about whether the penalties were harsh, symbolic, overdue, or cathartic. Lena read none of it. She was too busy negotiating a multi-hospital rehabilitation network contract under terms that protected patient data, inventor credit, and emergency continuity if any future executive ever again imagined illness created ownership opportunities. She named the clause Daniel protection in the first private draft, then changed it to continuity safeguard before circulation because some loves did not need public labels to remain foundational. Meridian itself was eventually sold in pieces, its viable operations absorbed under court supervision and its theater stripped away. Several former employees joined Mercer Continuum. Others disappeared into industries where no one knew their part in the old arrangement. Lena wished them exactly the future they had earned. Spring opened the city again. With litigation mostly behind them, Lena let herself inhabit success rather than merely defend it. She bought a loft with wide windows and a kitchen large enough for friends. She restored her mother's bracelet and wore it to the opening of the Mercer Center for Adaptive Recovery, a research and training institute funded partly from the settlement Adrian had once assumed he could deny her by forging a signature. Young engineers toured the labs with the reverence of people entering a place built by someone whose name they had heard correctly from the start. Daniel gave a speech so affectionate and embarrassing that Lena threatened, inaccurately, to cut his microphone. Nora cried openly and blamed allergies. Gabriel stood slightly behind the front row until Lena took his hand and drew him forward where he belonged. He had never competed with her light. That, she realized, was one of the reasons being loved by him felt so radically safe. Months later, on a night unremarkable enough to be perfect, Gabriel cooked dinner in her loft while she reviewed grant notes at the counter. There were no violinists, no rooftop drones, no camera-ready pedals. Just garlic and oil, rain against the glass, and a first-edition medical memoir he set beside her plate after they ate. "Open it," he said. Inside, nestled in the cutout where the center pages had been carefully and apologetically altered, was a ring elegant enough to whisper. Lena laughed before she could stop herself. "You hollowed out a book," she said. "A duplicate edition," Gabriel replied at once. "The archival copy remains intact." "I know your standards." She looked up at him, this maddeningly precise man who believed romance should survive scrutiny. "And what exactly are you asking, Gabriel?" He rested both hands on the table, steady as always. "Partnership. Fully informed, revocable only by mutual catastrophe, respectful of separate workspaces, and unconditional regarding credit, ambition, and difficult weeks. Also marriage, if you want that version of the contract." Lena stood and crossed the small space between them. "I do," she said, and kissed him before he could refine the terms. They married 6 months later in a quiet ceremony with fewer than 30 guests and no publicist within 100 miles. Daniel walked Lena in because he insisted, not because she needed handing over. Nora signed as witness and later declared the cake legally sound. Gabriel wore his mother's fountain pen in his jacket pocket. Lena kept her own name and added nothing she did not choose. During the vows, Gabriel promised never to ask her to become smaller for ease of admiration. Lena promised never to confuse privacy with silence when something mattered. The room understood the weight of both. They built a life afterward that was not free of conflict or fatigue or ordinary human failure, but it was free of theft. In the years that followed, Mercer Continuum expanded internationally, the scholarship program tripled, and young women in rehabilitation engineering began citing Lena's published work without needing anyone to tell them whose mind had made the field move. Sometimes, when articles resurfaced about Adrian's rise and collapse, strangers asked Lena whether she regretted anything. She regretted the years spent translating herself into shapes a weaker man could tolerate. She regretted every time she defended his vanity as vulnerability, every time she mistook being needed for being cherished, every time she thought endurance was nobler than exit. But she did not regret the correction. She did not regret the fight. And she did not regret surviving long enough to watch the architecture of her own life bear her true name again, clean and visible, above doors no one else would ever lock her out of. In the end, Adrian lost what he had spent years stealing: access, authority, credibility, and the illusion that another person's brilliance could be worn like a tailored suit. Camille lost the fantasy that being selected by power was the same thing as becoming powerful. Lena lost a marriage that had hollowed around her long before surgery made the emptiness visible. What she gained was everything they thought they could take without consequence: her work, her future, her name, her peace, and a love that never once required her to resemble anyone else. And that was the justice of it. Not that the man who betrayed her fell, though he did. Not that the woman who helped him faced consequences, though she did. The deepest justice was that after all their schemes, all their signatures, all their lies, Lena still stood exactly where they had most wanted to erase her, at the center of her own life, fully seen, fully credited, and finally beyond the reach of anyone who mistook her strength for something they could steal. The first summer after the trial felt almost suspicious in its calm, as if the city itself were waiting for another scandal to burst through the glass. But nothing burst. No secret accounts surfaced. No miraculous reversal rescued Adrian. No magazine profile tried to rebrand Camille as misunderstood. The machinery of consequence, once set in motion, continued with the dull, satisfying persistence of gravity. Adrian's appeal attorneys filed motions that went nowhere. Camille entered a restitution agreement that consumed every visible trace of the gilded life she had once flaunted online. Meridian's old investors moved on to newer founders with cleaner narratives. The world did what it always did after spectacle: it lost interest. Lena found that she did not mind. Attention had never healed anything. Quiet did. She settled into the rhythm of work that belonged only to her. Mornings in the Mercer Center began with clinical review and ended, more often than not, in some corner of the lab where an engineer had a question no one else could answer with enough precision. She loved those moments most. Not speeches. Not contracts. Not the elegant cruelty of cross-examination. Just the click of a thought finding its proper shape under pressure. Daniel visited often enough that the staff stopped treating him like a guest and started calling him the unofficial morale department. Nora continued to oversee legal strategy, though now it was mostly about expansion and guardrails rather than triage. She liked to pretend she missed the war. Lena knew better. Nora enjoyed winning, but what she had wanted all along was a world where Lena could work without fighting for the right to say her own name in the room. Gabriel became woven into that world so naturally that Lena sometimes forgot there had been a period when he was anything less than essential. They never merged companies, despite what business reporters kept predicting. He had been serious about partnership without acquisition, and over time she understood that this was not merely admirable but rare. They challenged one another fiercely in private, especially on pricing ethics and rural rollout timelines, but disagreement with Gabriel never resembled diminishment. He argued toward clarity, not dominance. On evenings when they were both too tired to be elegant, they ate takeout on the floor of the half-furnished loft and discussed everything from tendon response lag to whether old mystery novels required better editors. Sometimes he worked beside her in companionable silence, the old fountain pen moving steadily across legal pads while she annotated trial data. Nothing about it glittered. Everything about it lasted. One afternoon in late July, Lena received a forwarded note from the rehabilitation unit at St. Catherine's. A young resident had used Continuum during a complex recovery case and wanted to thank the doctor who built the system that gave our patient back his gait. Attached was a shaky photograph of an elderly man taking careful steps between parallel bars while two grandchildren clapped from the edge of the frame. Lena stared at the image for a long time. 8 years earlier, Adrian would have turned that story into a marketing reel before the family reached the elevator. Lena printed the photograph and pinned it inside her office cabinet where only she could see it when she reached for lab protocols. Some victories were too sacred for publicity. Some proof mattered more when it stayed private. In early autumn, the court finalized the remaining civil judgments. Funds from Adrian's forfeitures and settlement proceeds transferred into Mercer Foundation accounts designated for patient access, scholarship support, and long-term research grants. The amount was substantial enough to make headlines, but Lena insisted every public statement emphasize purpose over punishment. The money had been dirty while under his control. It would be clean only if redirected toward the people his theft had almost deprived. She launched a national mobility equity program before the quarter ended and expanded subsidized device access to 12 public hospitals. When the board congratulated her on turning devastation into legacy, she thanked them politely and thought, "No. I turned theft back into usefulness." Legacy was just what other people called it after the paperwork cleared. A month later, she and Gabriel returned to St. Catherine's for a donor dinner she had once promised the surgical team during recovery. The same 12th-floor windows still looked out over the river, though now the sight no longer tasted of betrayal. During cocktails, the nurse supervisor who had exposed the medication chart request approached, nervous in a dark blue dress she kept smoothing at the waist. "I'm glad you're well," she said. "I've always worried I should have done more sooner." Lena took her hand. "You did exactly enough at the exact moment it mattered." The woman's eyes filled instantly. Across the room, Gabriel watched and did not interrupt. He understood, as always, that rescue was not ownership and gratitude did not need staging. On the drive home, Lena rested her head against the seat and let memory drift through her without flinching. The hospital no longer belonged to Adrian's crime. It belonged, in part, to the people who had refused to help him commit it. The anniversary of the wedding that wasn't came and went without ceremony. No public post marked it. No private bitterness sharpened the date. Lena spent the day reviewing a fellowship application cycle, then met Gabriel and Daniel for dinner at a small restaurant near the river. Halfway through dessert, Daniel lifted his glass and said, "To my sister," who finally stopped underestimating the force of her own right hook. Lena laughed so hard she nearly spilled coffee. Gabriel raised his glass too. "To your sister," he said, "who now uses that force with excellent precision." It struck her then how complete the shift had become. There was a time when every room had required vigilance, translation, and a careful calibration of male ego before she could speak plainly. Now she was surrounded by people who did not fear her strength, did not envy it, did not try to bill against it or borrow it for public shine. That was not a small miracle. It was a new foundation. Years later, when students and founders asked how she survived the scandal, Lena rarely gave them the answer they expected. She did not talk first about betrayal, though betrayal had been brutal. She did not talk first about resilience, though resilience had been necessary. She talked about documentation. About naming what is yours before someone teaches the room to misremember it. About refusing to confuse love with surrender, urgency with trust, attention with respect. About how power often arrives smiling and asking for only one exception, one signature, one simplification, one private compromise in the name of partnership. She taught them that the most dangerous thefts begin long before the crime becomes visible, in the small daily rehearsals where a capable woman is asked to step half a pace back so a less capable man can look whole. And she taught them, with the calm authority of someone who had paid for the lesson in blood and recovery, that the first correction is rarely loud. It is simply the moment you stop participating in your own erasure. On winter nights, when the loft windows reflected the city back at itself and Gabriel was reading in the chair by the lamp while rain moved gently across the glass, Lena sometimes thought of the woman she had been in that hospital bed, stitched, feverish, betrayed, and still, despite everything, one phone call away from becoming dangerous to the man who thought she was finally weak enough to steal from. She felt tenderness for that version of herself now. Not pity. Respect. That woman had been wounded, yes, but she had also been intact in all the places that mattered. Adrian never understood that. He thought exhaustion meant vacancy. He thought love meant access. He thought a signature could become a transfer of soul if the paperwork was neat enough. He was wrong. And because he was wrong, Lena's story did not end in the hospital, or the courthouse, or the wedding photo that once tried to define her absence. It ended where it should have ended all along, with her work in her own hands, her future chosen rather than assigned, her name restored not as ornament but as authorship, and the people who tried to exploit her watching every scheme collapse under the weight of the truth they had spent too long dismissing. She had not simply survived them. She had outbuilt them, outlasted them, and then walked so far beyond their reach that the ruin they left behind became nothing more than proof of what happens when greed mistakes a brilliant woman's grace for permission. The final justice was not only that Adrian went to prison and Camille paid for her part. It was that neither of them remained important enough to haunt her. Lena Mercer did not spend the rest of her life looking back at the people who tried to bury her. She spent it building, healing, loving, and rising so completely that their betrayal became a footnote beneath the empire of truth she reclaimed with her own hands.